Welcome back, TV spoilers. Daniel didn't go to see Cain as a curious man looking for answers, but as a son who had paid too many prices to keep believing in convenient explanations. In this city where every smile can be a mask, Daniel carried that cold, crawling instinct that always surfaced whenever he pictured Cain standing too close to Phyllis. He didn't deny his mother's strengths and items, it was frightening in its own right. But because he understood Phyllis so well, the danger felt sharper when she stepped into any bond stitched together from loneliness, impulse, and wounds that hadn't fully closed. Phyllis could win wars out in the open, yet against her own blind spots she could become the most reckless person in the room. Daniel couldn't bear the thought of watching her charge into a situation she believed she controlled, only to discover that what she called agency had been a trap laid long before she arrived. The place Daniel chose wasn't crowded, but it wasn't so sealed off that it could swallow everything like a criminal pact either. He wanted Cain to understand this wasn't a conversation that could be brushed aside. And it wasn't a vague threat from a jealous bystander. It was a space just private enough for breathing to become audible, just exposed enough that eyes couldn't hide in a crowd, and just tense enough that every unsaid word still landed like a stone. Daniel walked in with his face drawn tight, fatigue visible, but determination even louder. He told himself on the way there that he was coming to protect Phyllis, not to explode. Yet the moment he saw Cain, the pressure inside him flared anyway. Cain was never easy to read. Sometimes he looked like a man who had lost everything and was trying to stand again, by any means necessary. Other times he carried the posture of someone who had walked through too many doors of power to doubt he could bend life back into shape, with the right handshake at the right time. Daniel saw the contradiction that kept his guard up, vulnerable and dangerous, capable of being a victim and a predator in the same breath. And right now, after Lily's rejection, after the widening distance with his children, Daniel knew Cain was raw enough that anyone who touched the right nerve could steer him. But Daniel also knew something harsher. Being hurt didn't make someone harmless. Sometimes pain and loss were exactly what turned a person into someone willing to do anything, just to feel valuable again. Daniel didn't circle the point because circling made it sound like negotiation. He laid out his concern about Cain and Phyllis. And it wasn't just a son's protective instinct, it was suspicion fed by small observations, by subtle signals that only people close to the story would recognize. Daniel didn't call Phyllis naive. He questioned the one thing that made this feel like a threat: timing. Cain was appearing when Lily had pulled away, when his children had turned their backs, when his pride was being stripped down by the sensation of abandonment. And Cain was drawing closer to Phyllis when Phyllis herself was unsteady-like. She always needed something to grip, a new fight, a new connection. Proof that her life still had cards left to play. Daniel looked at those two kinds of instability and saw a storm forming. One that wouldn't just bruise people but would drag them down in the cruelest way. As Daniel spoke, he could feel two forces fighting inside him. One was reason, insisting he stay controlled, present his case clearly, make Cain understand this wasn't mere dislike, it was evidence-based fear. The other was emotion, pushing him toward the edge. Because Daniel had seen Phyllis get pulled into spirals she walked into with confidence, and left with scars. He'd watched her use toughness to hide fear, boldness to patch loneliness, victory to compensate for nights when she had no one to lean on. Daniel didn't want Cain to become the next chapter in that cycle. He didn't want his mother forcing a smile again, pretending she was fine again, burying fractures deeper again. So Daniel delivered a warning that was clean and hard, without decoration. He told Cain to stay away from Phyllis. He made it clear Cain had no right to use Phyllis's current fragility for any purpose, whether it was temporary comfort or a long game. Daniel didn't name specific schemes, but the way he looked at Cain turned the moment into an indictment. Daniel believed Cain's approach was about more than feelings, and that chilled him because if there was calculation behind it, then Phyllis wouldn't simply be a grown woman choosing a relationship to be a tool in the hands of a desperate man who needed leverage and reassurance. Daniel brought up Lily not to taunt, but to force Cain to face reality. Lily had refused him, not in a careless burst of anger, but with the weary clarity of someone who had watched the same patterns repeat too many times. Daniel spoke of Cain's children cutting contact as proof that Cain had crossed some kind of linear, at least had damaged trust so deeply that the people closest to him no longer saw him as safe. To Daniel, these weren't private family details to gossip about. They were risk factors. If Cain couldn't hold Lily's faith, if he was losing the relationships that once grounded him, what would stop him from clinging to Phyllis like a life raft and then, consciously or not, pulling her under when that raft wasn't enough? Daniel didn't have to insult Cain to make him look bad. He simply placed Cain where Cain already stood, a man sliding away from the relationships that used to define him. And that position, Daniel believed, was where Cain became most dangerous. Because a person drowning in loss often convinces himself he deserves compensation. And once he believes that, he starts granting himself permission to do things he'd never do when life was stable. Daniel mentioned Cain's vulnerability not to pity him, but to say he saw it because he saw it. He couldn't allow Cain anywhere near Phyllis. Then Daniel touched the part that made the air thicken instantly: Cain's past. He didn't list details. He didn't invent anything. He simply implied what Cain already knew, that there were corners of his history, secrets and dark pages that could be dragged into the light. Daniel spoke like someone who had heard enough, understood enough, and had decided that if it came to it, he would expose everything. It wasn't the voice of a man trying to win an argument. It was the voice of a son willing to be the villain to keep his mother safe. Daniel understood the cost of exposing secrets. It would poison the atmosphere, turn life into a battlefield, and pull Phyllis into a different kind of storm. But he also understood something worse: Restless could become complicity. If Cain planned to exploit Phyllis or harm her, Daniel wouldn't stand still. Cain reacted sharply, not with panic, but with offense. He denied the accusations, tried to downplay what was happening with Phyllis as if Daniel were exaggerating. He held himself with the rigid posture of someone insisting he'd been misunderstood, using anger to build a wall, implying Daniel was just an overprotective son. But that didn't make Daniel retreat. Daniel had seen this kind of denial too many times in this town. The closer someone is to being touched by the truth, the louder they push back with outrage. Cain tried to reframe everything as misunderstanding, tried to make Daniel believe he was simply searching for normal connection in a hard moment. Daniel didn't come here to believe. He came to draw a line. And the more Cain tried to soften it, the clearer one thing became to Daniel: Cain was trying to control how the story would be told. To Daniel, that was the most suspicious sign of all. If Cain were truly clean, he wouldn't need to twist the context so desperately, wouldn't need to paint Daniel as paranoid. Daniel refused to let the conversation become a debate about his emotions. He pulled it back to the only point that mattered: Phyllis's safety. He clarified that this wasn't about whether Cain liked his mother or had rights to her life. It was about what Cain might do with Phyllis's vulnerabilities, what Daniel would do if he saw Cain touch them. Daniel wouldn't accept Cain's explanations, because Daniel had learned a brutal lesson: explanations often arrive before betrayals, like fresh paint over rotten wood. He repeated his boundary, firm and unembarrassed. He didn't demand promises because promises were easy. He didn't request more justification because justification was a weapon in itself. He left Cain with one thing: if Cain hurt Phyllis, if he used her unsteadiness to suit the pride Lily and his children had stripped away, Daniel would drag Cain's darkest secrets into the light, even if it turned their world into hell. Daniel knew that choice could make him look ruthless. He accepted that. He would rather be hated than watch his mother collapse under another betrayal. When Daniel walked away, there was no feeling of victory, only a weight heavy as stone, pressed against his chest, because Daniel knew a warning was just the beginning. A boundary only mattered if the person on the other side respected it, or feared the cost of crossing it. Daniel didn't know which Cain would choose. He also didn't know how Phyllis would react if she found out Daniel had gone this far, because Phyllis hated being protected in ways that made her look like a victim. Daniel stepped out of that private space with a sharper fear than the one he'd walked in with. The fear that Cain wouldn't back off, and the fear that Phyllis, with her pride and her need to prove she couldn't be controlled, might move closer simply because she refused to let anyone decide for her. Daniel told himself he'd done the right thing, but even as he did, he felt like he'd touched a wire stretched too tight, and he had no idea which direction it would snap. And as he forced himself to breathe, one thought flashed through him like a missing piece clicking into place. If Cain was wounded enough to cling to Phyllis, then the question wasn't only what Cain intended, it was who would reach for that wound first, and who would tell the next version of this story in the most dangerous way. And Daniel suddenly realized he might have just started a game in which Cain had already prepared his next move. Daniel went to Phyllis not as part of a casual check-in, but as a survival reflex after days of watching his mother move too fast, too confidently, and far too much like she had in the moments that once began with an opportunity and ended with a price no one could pretend was worth it. He arrived with his body locked tight, as if every breath had to push through invisible pressure. Out there, the story around Newman Enterprises was stretched to a breaking point. Rumors of power plays and traps tied to AI technology spreading in every direction, dangerous enough to scorch anyone who reached in. Daniel knew Phyllis wasn't someone who could be intimidated, and she was never the type to stand outside the spotlight when the brightest lights were aimed at the center of a war. But that was exactly why he was afraid. He was afraid of how alive Phyllis became when she sensed a return to the position she believed she deserved. Afraid of how she clung to a plan the way someone clings to proof that they still have power. And most of all afraid of how Cain appeared at the precise moment. Everything was fragile like a missing piece that fit too perfectly to be trusted. Phyllis met Daniel with that familiar calm of hers, a calm that rarely meant she felt nothing. And more often meant she had learned to hide everything behind a face that refused to reveal its cracks. Daniel recognized it instantly, and instead of soothing him, it made him more restless. He had lived long enough inside the blast radius of his mother's bold decisions to understand that Phyllis's composure wasn't always a sign of certainty, it was sometimes the sign of a resolve pushed so far it left no room for hesitation. Daniel's fear wasn't only for her safety. It was for the softer, more fragile things, the reputation she had fought to rebuild, the trust she had clawed back through relentless battles, and the standing in this power-driven community that she always had to reprove. He knew one mistake could cut deeper than a bruise. One misstep could attach Phyllis to a new narrative as a reckless woman who never learned where the edge was. The confrontation came immediately, clean and direct, more like a decisive cut than a lingering scratch. Daniel didn't hide his opposition, and it didn't carry the tone of a gentle suggestion. It carried the urgency of a desperate warning. He looked at Phyllis and named what had been stealing his sleep: her alliance with Cain, her willingness to work with him in a scheme aimed at taking Newman Enterprises, and the frightening confidence she wore as if this were a guaranteed win. Daniel didn't see Cain as merely risky, he saw him as a dangerous pull, a familiar shadow that followed trouble, and a man capable of turning anything into a weapon when it served him. In Daniel's mind, Cain was never a choice. Cain was a hazard being invited inside. He reminded Phyllis of Cain's troubled past in a way that didn't require long lists to thicken the air. Daniel didn't need to recite every scandal or every mistake. Simply invoking the dark side Cain always carried like a second skin was enough to force the point. Daniel knew his mother hated being told what she already knew. But he also knew Phyllis had a habit that terrified him. When she wanted something badly enough, she could convince herself the risk wasn't real anymore. She could control the other person. She could steer the outcome. This time would be different. Daniel didn't want to hear this time is different ever again. He had seen too many different beginnings end in humiliation, damage, and loss. Daniel pushed deeper into the danger Phyllis was trying to downplay: legal exposure. He didn't see a plan to seize Newman Enterprises as a simple chess move. He saw a slick slope toward a place where every mistake could be recorded, every action could be labeled, and every trap could be built from the very technology they believed they were handling. He raised the possibility of being framed for AI theft like a blade pressed against bone. Because it wasn't just a question of reputation or pride, it was an accusation that could crush a life. Daniel looked at Phyllis and saw her gambling with things she treated as strategy, while in reality they could become evidence. One wrong step, one data point in the wrong place, one digital trace left behind, and Phyllis would no longer be the powerful woman reclaiming her position. She would become a headline, the symbol of ambition that crossed a line. But the pain Daniel carried wasn't only legal. What cut deeper was the personal cost he could already see, the cost he believed Phyllis was choosing not to look at. He spoke about reputation not as a shallow concept, but as something almost physical. Something Phyllis had had to tear off and stitch back together with sheer will. In their world, reputation wasn't gossip. It was access. It was doors opening or closing. It was a seat at the table and the way people believed you or didn't when you walked into a room. Daniel spoke about trust as something you couldn't buy back through victories. Because trust didn't come from being right or wrong. It came from whether people were still willing to give you another chance. If this alliance looked reckless, if this plan got branded as a takeover, everything Phyllis had built could collapse in a way that couldn't be repaired. Daniel didn't want his mother to become the person people watched with suspicion again. He didn't want her name spoken like a warning. Phyllis responded the way Daniel had expected, and that familiarity made him feel both helpless and furious. She defended herself with arguments that had been sharpened, not panic. Phyllis framed it as an opportunity to regain her standing and protect her own interests. Like she had waited too long for a moment strong enough to flip the board. There was that familiar fire in her eyes, the fire that had kept her alive, kept her standing, kept her returning to the center when others tried to shove her to the margins. Phyllis didn't see herself as reckless. She saw herself as fighting to avoid being left behind, fighting not to be defined by failure, fighting to stop other people from writing the next chapter of her life. In the way she defended her position, Daniel heard fear of losing control, a need to prove she could still win, and a stubbornness grown from years of being underestimated. Daniel tried to stay calm, but that calm was scraped thin by a familiar sensation, the feeling of standing in front of a storm. and trying to stop the wind with his hands. He pleaded with Phyllis to rethink it, not because he wanted her to become smaller or retreat, but because he wanted her to survive without paying with herself. He tried to pull her out of the dangerous spiral he believed Kane represented. Whether Kane meant to or not, Daniel could see something clearly when Phyllis entered this alliance. She wasn't only partnering with Kane, she was partnering with the part of herself that was always drawn to the rush of being back. The thrill of proving she still mattered, the hunger of standing on top. That was the part of her most easily ignited, the part most likely to close its eyes to consequences. Daniel didn't want his mother falling back into a place where she would have to become ruthless, to save herself and then hate herself for what that ruthlessness turned her into. Their tension wasn't really about who was right. It was about how both of them believed they were protecting what mattered most. Daniel protected Phyllis with fear, with vigilance, with sharp images of courtrooms, accusations, reputations collapsing, and the cold looks from people who had only recently been willing to trust her again. Phyllis protected herself with the belief that if she didn't seize this chance, the power system she had served, fought, and been hurt by would grind her down. She refused to live as someone passive, someone waiting for others to decide her fate. She especially refused to be forced into good behavior just to be accepted. Daniel saw that, and because he saw it, it hurt more. He realized Phyllis's insecurity hadn't disappeared. It had simply been wrapped in ambition. The confrontation slid toward the moment where words stopped being strong enough to change anything. Daniel felt it. Every argument he made, no matter how correct, was hitting the wall of Phyllis's determination. And what frightened him most was that Phyllis didn't counterattack with loud anger. And she didn't break into tears. She fought with silence, a calculated silence, held long enough that Daniel felt as if he had touched the deepest place. She refused to let anyone enter. Phyllis didn't deny him outright, and she didn't agree. She simply kept her face unreadable, as if she had heard every warning, weighed every consequence, and then locked it all inside a sealed drawer no one could open. That silence wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't refusal either. It felt like an ellipsis stretched thin, a way of saying the story didn't end here. Daniel left with heavier uncertainty than he'd carried in. He couldn't tell whether he had planted doubt in her, or whether he had only made her more determined to prove him wrong. He didn't know if Phyllis went silent because she finally saw a crack in the plan, or because she was hiding a decision already completed in her mind. The only thing Daniel was sure of was this: when Phyllis said nothing, it rarely meant weakness. It often meant a move being held back. He walked out with a vague, persistent dread, as if in trying to pull his mother away from the spiral. He had discovered the spiral was already close enough to touch, and when Daniel replayed Phyllis's final look in his mind, he couldn't decide whether it belonged to a woman considering turning back or to a woman who had stared into the drop and chosen to keep going, only slower this time, quieter, so no one would notice until it was too late. On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.